Hello everyone, this presentation is all about the German verb, but don't worry, there's no conjugating involved in this presentation. Instead, I'm actually going to be looking at the position of German verbs in the clause. So I'm not only going to be focusing on modern German, I'm actually going to be providing a historical view of different structures throughout the history of German. So this presentation will be for Linguistics 508, also known as Theories of Syntax, offered at California State University, Fullerton, under the direction of Dr. Mueller. So before we get into the meat of the presentation, I just want to give an overview of what I'll be discussing. So I'm going to begin with a brief introduction before moving on to some conventions, and then I'm going to start dealing with verbal positions. So I'm going to start off with modern German, and I'm going to discuss how there are different positions for the verb to occur in. So it can either be at the beginning of the clause, it can be a V2 element, that is to say that it's the second element, or it can also be the verb final, which means that it's actually at the end of the clause. And then I'm going to be providing an historical view of subordinate clauses, as well as looking at different positions that the verb can occur in historical time periods of German, before moving on to the conclusion and, of course, contact and references. So just a brief introduction. Just languages are constantly evolving, and from this evolution we're able to kind of see the changes that have manifested with the language. So the presentation will focus on the placement of verb not only in modern German, but I'm going to be providing an historical view not only on subordinate clauses, but as well as just examples of where this verb or these verbs appeared throughout the history of German. So different periods of time that I'll be focusing on today: Old High German, Middle High German, Early New High German, and of course modern German. So just want to get into a little bit of conventions here. I just adapted the conventions from SAP 2011. He was using numbers, and I prefer to use alpha characters. I find them much more easier to remember and less confusing. So instead of using a number 1, I'm going to be using the abbreviation FV, which stands for a finite verb. I'm going to be using NFV, which stands for a non-finite verb, and then I'm going to be using DNFV, which is just a dependent on the non-finite verb. So SAP 2001 was using numbers, and I just found them to be a little bit confusing after a while. Sometimes I forgot what the number actually stood for. So just looking at some verbal positions now. German is considered to be an SOV language, that is to say that the subject will appear before the object and the verb will actually be at the end of the clause. An example is that is in the sentence, dass du mich liebst. That you love me. So liebst is the finite verb, and it appears at the end of the clause. So depending on the clause, verbs in German can appear in a number of positions. They can either be at the very beginning, they can actually be the second element, which is pretty much a shared property amongst the Germanic family, except for English that has some residual patterns, but really other Germanic languages are very V2. So an example of this V2, where it appears as the second element, is Dieses Wochenende gehe ich ins Kino mit meiner Freundin. So the finite verb actually appears as the second element, right after this weekend, which appears as in a topicalization part of syntax tree. There are also verb clusters. So an example of that is Klaus will heute das Buch lesen können. So a verb cluster is when you have two verbs or more together. So the presentation, I said, will present examples illustrating how the position of verbs have evolved throughout German's history. So just a little bit focus now on verb V1 in modern German. So in modern German, there are cases with V1 that means that the verb is the first element of the sentence, and this really happens in questions. So because of this, there's actually movement. So there's T to C movement, and this can be visualized if we look at the X-bar syntax tree up in the top right. So we're looking at the syntax tree, we can see that the T is at the very end, and that's from the verb haben. But actually it gets moved up into the tree because there's nothing filling this the C position, so it can move from T to C, thus allowing the finite verb to appear as the first element. So an example of that is in the sentence, Haben die Kinder den neuen Film gesehen? Have you seen the new movie yesterday? Sorry. And you can actually say in English, the auxiliary have actually moves up as well. So in English there's even a movement as well. Other examples of where verbs can occur as the first element is in imperatives. So you can have komm hier, and this is also the same in other languages. Viens ici for French, ven aquí for Spanish, which translates to come here. So looking again for V1, the previous example showed a T to C movement, but there are cases in which there is a movement before and that's actually V to T. So an example would be is Sie Deutsch sprechen, which is kind of the base position, but we move it up again to sprechen Sie Deutsch is the actual question of do you speak German. So the verb sprechen, meaning to speak, is found in the base position and moves from V to T, but to form an interrogative clause it moves yet again from T to C. So other languages, including English, do this movement with have you seen the doctor yet? So V2 now is very common amongst the Germanic family. So main clause word order is that of subordinate clauses differ. So basically there's a difference. There's an asymmetry between main clauses and subordinate clauses with word order. So SAP 2011 explains that in main clauses the finite verb appears as the V2 and any non-finite verb or particle appears at the end. So an example of this is Bastian Schweinsteiger gehe mit seiner Freundin aus. So the finite verb is gehe, and then we have a particle. Ausgehen is a separable prefix verb, so the particle or the preposition gets pushed to the very end of the clause. So that's where the aus gets broken off and moved there. So Vickner 95 and Axel 2007 explain that the position where the finite verb will stand in a main clause is the result of verb movement, which is what I've been expressing before with the syntax trees. So Axel 2007 explains that FVs move left without complementizers and independent clauses. The finite verb remains in the base position if this movement is blocked. So I'm just going to be giving an example of really where this movement can be blocked is when we're looking at subordinate clauses. And that'll come a little bit later on. But V2 is a common property for Germanic languages, as I said, with the exception of English, which has residual patterns. So you can see that there's another T to C movement in this clause. So an example of this is in Die Kinder haben diesen Film gesehen. So there's movement of T to C. So the T is at the end of the clause and it gets moved up into the C because there's nothing already in the specifier of C position, so it can move up gladly, thus satisfying the V2 factor of Germanic languages. So now looking at subordinate clauses, we can see in modern German, subordinate clauses can be introduced by certain complementizers, and the finite verb appears at the far right periphery of the clause joined to the separable prefix or particle, if any. So example of this is in a main clause, du liebst mich nicht, you don't love me, and then we throw in a complementizer, dass du mich nicht liebst. So all of a sudden the verb gets thrown right to the far right of the sentence. Other examples is Klaus will heute das Buch lesen. Klaus wants to read the book today. Throw in another complementizer, weil, which means because, and then the finite verb gets thrown again to the right. Weil Klaus heute das Buch lesen will, because Klaus wants to read the book today. Another example, ich mache meine Hausaufgaben, bevor ich mit meinen Freunden ausgehe. I do my homework before I go out with my friends. So looking now again at subordinate clauses, we can see that the finite verb does not move because the specifier position of C is filled by a complementizer, thus preventing movement. As a result, the finite verb stands itself at the end of the clause. So, dass die Kinder den Film gesehen haben. Haben in this case cannot move up because the specifier of C position is blocked. So that reviews a quick detail about modern German. So at this point in time, I'm just going to be looking at some historical structures of German. Once again, focusing on Old High German, Middle High German, and early New High German. Okay, so I just want to give a little bit of examples dealing with the different periods of German. So with Old High German, Axel 2007 comments on Gothic's influence where enclitic particles moved, and explains on Robert's 1996 findings that in Gothic there were two movements. One was dealing with the enclitic particles and another movement was without them. So it was hypothesized that the second placement of verbs in Gothic reached early forms of Germanic languages, which resulted in the loss of particles. And then Fagan 2009 comments on the position of finite verbs and how its position is a possible influence of Latin, whereas the final verbs is inherited by Indo-European. So continuing on with Old High German, Old High German is the underlying SOV language. However, in translations, there's actually they are heavily influenced by Latin. So there is evidence for or it suggested that Old High German was an OV language because many OV languages tend to have adjectives that precede the nouns, except for English. So example is das rote Auto and the red car in English, where the adjective is before, but Latin languages or Romance languages have it where the noun will be before the adjective. So we have examples of l'automobile rouge for French, or el coche rojo for Spanish, and then in Portuguese, o carro vermelho. So in these cases we have the noun, and then we have the the adjective that follows it. So dealing with Old High German again still, again 2009 provides insight on Old High German where verbs appearing as V1 were used for emphatic or discourse purposes. So an example that I have here, I put in red as the finite verb feared, and it appears at the very beginning. And then as well as Axel actually was commenting on the fact that there's a particle tho, which actually is an adverbial element, and when that's available, it actually means that the verb will appear as the first element. But throughout the course of German, this tho particle disappeared. And so Axel 2007 comments on the V1, and then in Old High German, and the specifier C position was occupied by various types of XP movement, and the position is filled by topicalized constituents. And then Old High German had high frequencies of V1 in declarative sentences where XPs were to find themselves, where the specifier C was unable to be an operator or a topic. So now looking quickly at Middle High German, or das klassische Mittelhochdeutsch, SAP 2011 rules out that word order in German is related to morphology, since German has retained much of its morphology, which kind of makes sense. Languages that are very rich in morphology tend to have less strict word orders, whereas languages like English that are weaker really with morphology and inflection tend to have much more strict word orders. So SAP 2011 examined numerous clauses in Middle High German and found three possibilities of verbal complexes, where the finite verb will follow the non-finite verb, where the finite verb will actually immediately precede the non-finite verb, or the finite verb will precede with a non-verbal constituent between the verbs, so something separating them. So here's a few examples. In the first example, the non-finite verb is before the finite verb. Second example, the finite verb is before the non-finite verb. And then in the second example, the non-finite verb is after the finite verb, and there's actually something separating them. So early New High German has structures that are similar to Middle German as well as Modern German. So the finite verb can appear before or after the non-finite verb, and there's no clause where a constituent appears between the non-finite verb and finite verb. So in the first sentence we have the finite verb that appears at the end of this clause, and the non-finite verb actually just appears right before it, which is common for Modern German now. The second sentence, the finite verb actually appears before the non-finite verb, but at the end of the clause. That's not too common in Modern German. The finite verb would have to appear at the end. And then in the third sentence we have the finite verb that appears before the non-finite verb, but there's actually some constituents that are separating them. So quickly, conclusion, verbs in German do not occupy one single position, as we've seen that they occupy various positions. So the positions of the verb becomes less flexible throughout the history of German. So V2 in German is definitely for main clauses as a result of T to C movement and the finite verb of the finite verb. And if there's a complementizer occupying the C position, then the finite verb stays in its base position. And then verb complexes can be as little as 2 verbs, and there's possibly 3. So if any questions, please don't hesitate to email me. There is my contact information, and these are the references. So thank you very much for watching the presentation, and I hope you enjoyed it.